In the quiet streets of Seattle, the morning light streamed through the large windows of Mr. Harrison's office. The city was awakening, and so was the power that Mr. Harrison held in his hands. As the CEO of a successful tech company, he had everything a man could dream of. A prosperous career, a family that, from the outside, seemed perfect, and the admiration of everyone around him. He was well respected, a man who prided himself on his accomplishments. At home, his wife Susan was the perfect complement. Elegant, poised, and always by his side at galas and social events, she was the picture of grace. For years, their marriage had been a source of pride for both. But recently, something had changed. Something Mr. Harrison couldn't explain. Susan, once his closest confidant, seemed to be slipping away, her gaze increasingly distant. He had noticed it in small ways, the way she would disappear for hours, sometimes even entire weekends with vague explanations, the coldness in her touch when they would sit together, the quiet, almost invisible space that had begun to grow between them. It wasn't an argument or a fight that created the distance. It was something far more insidious, an emotional disconnect that Mr. Harrison couldn't put his finger on. He tried to dismiss it. After all, his life was full of stress and pressure. He worked long hours, attending meetings, solving problems, pushing his company forward. Perhaps Susan was just adjusting to the rhythm of their life, too. She had always been the one to handle the social aspects, to make sure everything ran smoothly, but lately, even that had begun to wane. She was never interested in the business side of things, but when she started showing little interest in his work, he knew something was amiss. But it wasn't until the company's annual retreat that the first real spark of suspicion ignited. The retreat was meant to be a bonding experience for the company, a break from the everyday grind. Mr. Harrison was busy with business meetings and events, but Susan was by his side, just as she always had been, or so he thought. It wasn't until that evening at the closing dinner that he noticed it. Jason Turner, the company's new consultant, a young and ambitious 30-year-old, had joined the retreat a few weeks before. He was sharp, articulate, and quickly became a favorite among the senior team members. Mr. Harrison had heard only good things about him, and he trusted him. He was, after all, an integral part of a critical project. But when he saw Susan and Jason engaged in conversation during the dinner, something in Mr. Harrison's gut twisted. They were laughing together, a private joke between them that he didn't quite understand. Jason was leaning in just a bit too close, his hand resting on the back of Susan's chair. He tried to brush it off, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. The night ended without incident, but as Mr. Harrison lay in bed beside Susan, his thoughts swirled in a storm of confusion and doubt. His mind raced as he recalled that fleeting moment. He had seen the way they looked at each other, the way their conversation flowed effortlessly. It wasn't just professional, it was personal. He couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't right. As he watched Susan sleep beside him, her face peaceful and serene, he wondered how long she had been slipping away. Was he so consumed by his work that he hadn't seen the signs? And what had she been doing while he wasn't paying attention? The following morning, everything seemed normal. Susan was smiling, talking about the eventful night, as if nothing had changed. But for Mr. Harrison, the world had shifted. The calm before the storm was no longer a comforting lull. It was the eye of a hurricane he could never have anticipated. The unsettling feeling remained with him for the rest of the retreat. But he didn't act on it. Not yet. He needed answers, but he didn't know how to ask the right questions without sounding paranoid, without sounding like a man who was losing control of the life he had so carefully built. The company retreat had come to a close, but Mr. Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. Despite the upbeat atmosphere, the laughter, and the socializing, a quiet unease gnawed at him. The night he spent lying awake beside Susan had been filled with racing thoughts. He couldn't help but replay the moments he had witnessed, the way Jason and Susan had interacted, the subtle touches, the laughter that seemed more intimate than friendly. Back at the office, everything appeared normal, but Mr. Harrison could no longer look at his wife the same way. His trust, once unshakable, was now fractured. Every glance she threw his way seemed laden with something he couldn't identify. Her responses to his questions seemed rehearsed, and he began to notice how quickly she would divert the conversation when it turned to anything related to Jason. Days passed, and the seed of doubt that had been planted in his mind during the retreat began to take root. It wasn't just the way Susan and Jason had looked at each other. It was the small, seemingly insignificant changes in her behavior. She was still the same woman he had married, but there was a subtle shift. Her gaze lingered on her phone too often, and when she thought he wasn't looking, she would quickly hide it away. Her laughter had become more distant, as though she were sharing private jokes with someone else, someone he didn't know. One morning, he walked into the kitchen to find Susan at the counter, texting someone on her phone. When she noticed him, she quickly slid it into her purse. Her face turned pale as she smiled awkwardly. "You okay?" Mr. Harrison asked, trying to mask the doubt building inside him. "Yeah, just work stuff," Susan replied, but her tone lacked conviction. Mr. Harrison stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of his suspicion. He'd always trusted her completely, but now every small gesture, every look, felt loaded with meaning. He couldn't understand why she was acting so secretive. Was it just him, or was she actually hiding something? That evening, after dinner, Mr. Harrison made a decision. He would follow up on his suspicions. He didn't want to believe it, but the feeling wouldn't go away. He couldn't let it linger. He needed answers, and for that, he would need proof. He had never considered hiring a private investigator before, but something inside him told him that the truth was just beyond reach, hidden beneath layers of lies and avoidance. He made the call later that night. The investigator was discreet and professional, promising to get the answers he sought without anyone being the wiser. As the days went by, Mr. Harrison found himself increasingly fixated on the idea that something was going on between Susan and Jason. His mind spun out of control with theories, scenarios, and confrontations that never seemed to have a satisfying conclusion. He tried to talk to Susan directly, but every time he did, she deflected. Her response was always the same. "I'm just busy, that's all." But her eyes told a different story. There was guilt there, a flicker of something deeper. Mr. Harrison knew he wasn't imagining it, and it was this realization that pushed him to the edge. He wasn't sure what he was going to find, but the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that his marriage was no longer what it appeared to be. That night, he waited for the investigator's report. His hands shook as he poured himself a glass of wine, the silence in the room swallowing him whole. Every second felt like an eternity. The doorbell rang. It was the investigator. "Here's what I found," the investigator said, handing over a folder. Inside were photos, flight details, and hotel receipts. Jason Turner's name was on each document. Mr. Harrison's heart sank as he sifted through the papers, each one confirming his worst fear. Susan was having an affair with Jason. There was no denying it. The truth was now laid bare in front of him, and with it a wave of emotions: anger, hurt, disbelief. How had he not seen it? How had Susan been able to hide this from him for so long? He sat back in his chair, staring at the photographs of his wife with Jason, their smiles intimate, their closeness undeniable. Mr. Harrison could feel his pulse quicken, the weight of betrayal sinking deeper and deeper into his chest. The man who had once believed in the inviolability of his family now found himself staring at the ruins of it. But even as the anger burned inside him, part of him couldn't help but feel a strange relief. At least now the truth was out. The seed of doubt had blossomed into full-blown certainty, and there was no turning back. The days following the investigator's report were some of the hardest Mr. Harrison had ever endured. His life, once a carefully constructed facade, now lay in ruins. The weight of the truth pressed down on him, suffocating any sense of clarity. He had always prided himself on his ability to manage business crises. But this was personal. This was betrayal on a level he hadn't prepared for. The investigator's findings were laid out before him. Mr. Harrison flipped through the folder with trembling hands. Each photograph, each hotel receipt, each detail like a dagger to the heart. His mind raced as he took in the cold, hard facts. Susan had been seeing Jason Turner for months. Their affair was more than just a fleeting moment of weakness. It was something planned, something deliberate. He could feel the anger bubbling up, threatening to boil over. How could she do this to him? To their family? How long had she been living this double life? The weight of the images, Susan laughing, holding hands with Jason in the hotel lobby, sharing intimate moments, felt like a betrayal of everything he had built, both personally and professionally. As Mr. Harrison stared at the photos, he found himself at a loss for words. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built his life with had been hiding something from him, something that now seemed to define their marriage more than the years of shared history they had accumulated. His mind kept returning to that moment at the company retreat, the way Susan and Jason had looked at each other, the way they seemed to share an unspoken connection that he hadn't been privy to. With a heavy sigh, Mr. Harrison closed the folder. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. There was no more doubt. He had suspected for days, but now the truth was staring him in the face. His wife was having an affair. But that wasn't all. Jason was clearly using this situation to his advantage, gaining more control over Susan than Mr. Harrison ever could have imagined. The anger didn't come in a rush. It built slowly, rising like a wave before it finally crashed. The truth had shattered something deep inside him. He couldn't decide whether to scream, to lash out, or to simply shut down. He felt humiliated, deceived, and, most of all, betrayed by the very person he had loved and trusted the most. He could hear the sound of Susan moving around the house, humming softly to herself, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. How could she be so calm, so collected? Didn't she feel the same weight of the situation? Did she even care? Mr. Harrison's thoughts spun in circles. Part of him wanted to confront her right then and there, but he knew it wasn't the right time. He needed to process this first, to figure out what he was going to do. The way his emotions swirled, anger, heartbreak, and confusion, left him feeling paralyzed. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for what they might bring. The next few days were a blur. Mr. Harrison threw himself into work, hoping that the pressure of running his company would distract him from the turmoil at home. But every time he looked at his phone, every time he heard Susan's voice, it was like a reminder of the deceit that hung between them. The affair wasn't just something happening in the background of his life. It had become the lens through which he now viewed everything. Then came the moment he had been dreading. Susan approached him one evening after dinner. She was acting strangely, almost too composed, as if she had rehearsed the conversation in her mind. Mr. Harrison knew the moment had arrived. It was time for him to confront her, to finally hear the truth from her lips. Susan sat down across from him, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and something else, perhaps fear, or maybe something darker. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mr. Harrison didn't need to hear the words. He already knew. "You've been seeing him, haven't you?" His voice was calm, but the question hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Susan hesitated, her eyes shifting nervously. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Then, in a voice that barely seemed to belong to the woman he had known, she admitted it. "Yes," she said softly. "I've been seeing Jason." The words hit Mr. Harrison like a slap. He felt his world tilt on its axis, but he managed to stay composed, his anger boiling just beneath the surface. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Susan looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "You've been so busy with work, with everything else. I felt alone. I never meant for it to go this far, but it did." Her explanation, though expected, only served to fuel his rage. She had justified her betrayal by blaming his work, as if that was an acceptable excuse, as if that somehow made it okay. But there was something else in Susan's eyes now, something Mr. Harrison hadn't expected to see. Regret? Guilt? Or was it just fear? Fear of the consequences, fear of the damage her actions had caused. Mr. Harrison stood up, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved toward the door. He couldn't stay there any longer, not with the weight of her words hanging in the air. He needed space to think, to process everything. But as he left the room, one final thought consumed him. How had it all gone so wrong? Mr. Harrison couldn't escape the nagging thoughts. As the days passed after Susan's admission, the weight of her betrayal grew heavier. The affair wasn't just a momentary lapse. It was a calculated series of decisions that had led them both to this point. He was consumed by the thought of how long this had been going on, how deeply Susan had allowed herself to be drawn into Jason Turner's web. In the quiet of the evening, Mr. Harrison found himself pacing the floor of their home, wrestling with the intensity of his emotions. The anger, the humiliation, it was all consuming. But beyond the fury, another realization dawned on him. This wasn't just about a marriage falling apart. There was something more sinister at play. Jason hadn't just stolen his wife's affection. He had manipulated her, used her for his own benefit, and worse yet, she had been too blinded by her own loneliness to see it. As Mr. Harrison thought back to the moments he had witnessed, he saw the truth in a new light. Jason hadn't just been the charming consultant he had initially seemed. He had been methodical, clever, and ruthless. He had wormed his way into their lives, offering Susan attention and affection when she needed it most, all the while building a power over her. But there was more to the story, something that shook Mr. Harrison to his core. Susan wasn't the only one hiding secrets. He had to know everything, and the only way to get the full picture was to confront her once again. He needed answers, not just about the affair, but about the depths of the betrayal. It was late one night when Mr. Harrison finally confronted Susan once more. This time his voice was steady, quieter than before. He had a new sense of control. He knew he couldn't let the chaos consume him any longer. It was time to lay everything bare. "Susan," he began, his tone colder than he had intended. "There's something I need to know. I can't just keep pretending I don't see it. I need the truth." Susan looked up from her phone, a look of fear flickering across her face. She had known this conversation was coming, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. She could see the change in him, the way his eyes no longer held the tenderness they once did. They were now hard, almost calculating. "Jason," he continued, the name hanging in the air between them. "It's not just the affair. It's the way you've been acting, the way you let him get so close. But there's something I'm not seeing, isn't there?" For a moment, Susan hesitated, her lips trembling. She had already confessed the affair, but she hadn't yet revealed the full extent of what had been happening. It wasn't just love, wasn't just a fleeting fling. She had been used. Jason had taken advantage of her vulnerability, her sense of isolation, and now it was all coming back to haunt her. With a deep sigh, Susan finally spoke. "I didn't just fall for him, Harrison. I've been giving him money. He threatened me, told me he'd expose everything about the affair, about us, to the press. He said I had to keep him happy or he'd ruin everything. And I didn't know what else to do." The words hung in the air like a punch to the gut. Mr. Harrison's mind reeled with the implications. Not only had Jason seduced his wife, but he had also manipulated her for financial gain, using her fears and vulnerabilities against her. "How long has this been going on?" Mr. Harrison's voice cracked, but he quickly regained his composure. "How long has he been blackmailing you?" Susan's face was pale, her eyes filled with regret. "Months. I never meant for it to go this far. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared. He kept saying things would get worse if I didn't comply." A cold silence fell between them. Mr. Harrison felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His mind reeled, trying to piece together the betrayal. Jason had been playing them both, Susan, who had fallen for his charm, and Mr. Harrison, who had trusted him. "Do you realize what you've done?" Mr. Harrison's words were barely above a whisper, his voice trembling with the weight of betrayal. He wasn't sure if he was talking to Susan or to himself. "I didn't want this, Harrison," Susan whispered, her voice shaky. "I didn't want to hurt you. I just wanted to feel loved again. I never wanted any of this to happen." The remorse in her voice should have been enough to soften his anger, but it didn't. The realization that his wife had been manipulated for so long, that she had willingly let herself be controlled by Jason, only deepened his sense of loss. "You didn't want this?" Mr. Harrison's voice was now a low growl. "And yet you let it happen. You let it go on for months. You let him into our lives, into our home. You chose him over me." Susan's tears started to fall, and she reached out to him, but Mr. Harrison pulled away. The emotional distance between them had become a physical wall, and no amount of apologies could break it down now. "I don't know what to say," Susan choked out. "I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back." But it was too late. Mr. Harrison couldn't look at her the same way again. The trust that had taken years to build had been shattered in an instant, and nothing could fix it now. As he walked away, he knew the path ahead was uncertain. The betrayal had been hidden beneath layers of lies, and now there was no turning back. He had learned the truth, and with it came the realization that his life would never be the same again. The days that followed Susan's confession felt like a blur. Mr. Harrison was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions: betrayal, rage, disbelief. But underneath it all, a cold, calculating fury began to take root. The affair had shattered the trust he had in Susan, but there was something more. The way Jason had wormed his way into their lives, not just as a lover, but as a manipulator. He had used Susan's vulnerabilities against her, and that made him more dangerous than anyone else in Mr. Harrison's life. The anger he felt was no longer just for his wife, it was for Jason. Jason had disrespected him, his family, and the trust they had built together. Mr. Harrison's mind began to spiral, consumed with thoughts of revenge. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about power, control, and showing Jason that he could not walk away unscathed. The man who had been focused solely on business, on building his company, was now focused on a different goal. He wanted to make Jason pay, to ensure that his betrayal didn't go unpunished. "I'll make him regret it," Mr. Harrison whispered to himself one evening, standing alone in his office. The rage simmered beneath the surface, quiet but intense. He knew he could use his position, his resources to destroy Jason. But something inside him told him that wouldn't be enough. No, this needed to be personal. Jason needed to understand that the consequences of his actions would not just be career-ending, they would be life-altering. Mr. Harrison started to lay the groundwork for his revenge. He couldn't just attack Jason directly, he had to be strategic. First, he would target Jason's credibility. He had spent years building a reputation of trust and success, and now it was time to leverage that to take Jason down. The young consultant had made a dangerous mistake by getting involved with Susan, but the real mistake had been underestimating Mr. Harrison's capacity for revenge. He began gathering evidence, digging into Jason's past, looking for anything that would tarnish his image. The more he dug, the more he discovered. Jason wasn't just the charming consultant he had thought he was. He had a history of using his relationships to advance his career, of leveraging personal connections for professional gain. There were whispers in the industry about his behavior, rumors of other affairs, and unethical business dealings. The pieces began to fall into place. But as Mr. Harrison worked to expose Jason, something unexpected happened. The more he focused on revenge, the more he neglected his own life. His relationship with Susan, once the most important thing to him, became something distant. They barely spoke anymore. She had apologized, begged for forgiveness, but Mr. Harrison was no longer the same man. His world had shifted, and all he could think about was bringing Jason to his knees. It was a late night when Mr. Harrison received a call from one of his colleagues, a confidant in the company. "You're not going to believe this," the colleague said. "Jason's been working on a project behind your back. He's been courting clients directly, trying to cut you out. And worse, he's been using the affair to get close to Susan. He's been playing both sides." The information hit Mr. Harrison like a freight train. The audacity of it, the manipulation, the lies, was more than he could bear. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. Jason had been undermining him professionally, using his personal turmoil as a tool to advance his own interests. It was a betrayal on every level. "Good," Mr. Harrison muttered under his breath, the fury building. "This is bigger than I thought." He wasn't just going to ruin Jason's career, he was going to destroy his entire life. The plan was set in motion. Mr. Harrison began using his connections to discredit Jason publicly. He leaked information about Jason's questionable business practices, sent anonymous tips to the press, and started using the affair as leverage to undermine Jason's professional relationships. Slowly but surely, Jason's career began to crumble. The clients he had been working with became wary, and the media started to take an interest in his personal life. The whispers of his extramarital affairs grew louder, and soon the truth about his manipulation began to seep into the public consciousness. But even as Mr. Harrison executed his plan, something inside him shifted. He realized that revenge wasn't bringing him the satisfaction he had hoped for. It was hollow, empty, and left him feeling more isolated than ever. He thought destroying Jason would give him a sense of control, but all it did was make him feel more disconnected from everything he once cared about. One evening, after a particularly harsh press article about Jason, Mr. Harrison sat alone in his office staring at the city lights. He thought about everything he had lost, the trust of his wife, his peace of mind, his reputation. It had all become tangled in a mess of revenge and destruction. Was this really the victory he had wanted? Was it worth it? As the anger began to subside, replaced by an aching emptiness, Mr. Harrison realized the truth. Revenge hadn't given him back what he had lost. It had only made everything worse. Mr. Harrison had been working relentlessly, his mind consumed by the web of lies and deceit that had ensnared his marriage. But as much as he tried to bury himself in work, the feeling of betrayal would not fade. Every corner of his office, every phone call, and every meeting seemed to echo with the image of Susan and Jason together. The affair had already torn apart his personal life, but now Jason was threatening to destroy his professional world too. It started with the rumors. At first they were whispers, small, almost imperceptible. But as days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder. Jason, the charming young consultant, was becoming a fixture in the company, always just a little too close to Mr. Harrison's clients, always just a little too friendly with Susan. He had wormed his way into the company under the guise of being a helpful, ambitious newcomer. But as Mr. Harrison dug deeper, he began to see the pattern emerging. Jason wasn't just using Susan, he was using the company as well. The betrayal at work didn't happen in one explosive moment. It crept in like a slow poison until Mr. Harrison could no longer ignore it. It began when Jason started taking credit for projects that Mr. Harrison had been working on for months. Jason's involvement in the company's dealings became more pronounced, and the rumors about his unethical behavior began to circulate. Clients began pulling back, hesitant to trust someone so closely tied to the scandal surrounding Mr. Harrison. One afternoon, Mr. Harrison sat in a meeting, his mind wandering as Jason presented yet another new initiative. The room was full of executives, all nodding in agreement, applauding Jason for his ideas. But it wasn't just the ideas that made Mr. Harrison's blood boil. It was the fact that Jason had positioned himself as the company's new savior, while Mr. Harrison was slowly becoming a pariah. He was being pushed aside without even realizing it, and Jason was taking full advantage. He had trusted Jason, had seen potential in the young consultant. But now, Jason's charm felt like a dagger to his back. Jason wasn't just an opportunist. He was a master manipulator, using his relationship with Susan to secure his place within the company, all the while undermining Mr. Harrison at every turn. Later that day, Mr. Harrison received a call from one of his most trusted colleagues, Robert, who had been in the company for years. The tone in Robert's voice was one of quiet concern. "Harrison, I've been hearing things," Robert said, his voice low. "There are talks. In the executive circles, people are starting to question your leadership. They're saying that the company's been slipping ever since Jason started making moves. You need to be careful." Mr. Harrison's jaw clenched. "What do you mean, slipping?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though the anger was building inside him. "The clients are getting nervous, and now people are starting to connect the dots. They're starting to talk about you and Susan. It's all a little too messy, Harrison. You've got to do something. You've got to stop him." The weight of the words hit him like a sledgehammer. Jason had not only undermined him personally, he was now threatening to tear apart the very company he had spent his life building. Mr. Harrison had given Jason access, trust, and responsibility, and Jason had repaid him by plotting behind his back, turning the people Mr. Harrison had worked so hard to win over against him. The betrayal at work was far worse than Mr. Harrison had initially realized. Jason had used the scandal with Susan as leverage, ingratiating himself with key clients and colleagues, manipulating the situation to his advantage. The idea that he had been working against Mr. Harrison this whole time while playing the part of the loyal consultant left a bitter taste in his mouth. Later that evening, Mr. Harrison confronted Jason in his office, his emotions teetering on the edge. Jason sat across from him, a confident smile on his face, as if he had nothing to hide. "I've heard the rumors, Jason," Mr. Harrison began, his voice cold. "You're using this whole situation, aren't you? Playing both sides. The affair, the business. It's all just one big game to you." Jason's smile didn't falter. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. "I'm just doing what's necessary, Harrison," Jason replied coolly. "The company is moving in a new direction. It's nothing personal. You know how business works. It's not about loyalty anymore, it's about results." Mr. Harrison felt a surge of anger. This was what it had come to. Jason, the man he had once trusted, was now speaking to him as if their years of work together were nothing more than a transaction. The betrayal, in that moment, hit harder than ever before. "You think you can just take over?" Mr. Harrison spat, his fists clenched. "You think you can tear everything down that I've built?" Jason's expression remained unchanged. "I'm just positioning myself where the company needs me. You can't deny the results. Maybe it's time for you to step back and let me lead." The final blow had been dealt. Jason had not only destroyed Mr. Harrison's personal life, but now he was trying to take control of his professional life as well. The anger Mr. Harrison had been holding in for days finally broke free. But as he looked at Jason, the man who had once been nothing more than an employee, a consultant, he realized that it was too late. Jason had already won. The days leading up to the confrontation had been a blur of tense silence and simmering anger. Mr. Harrison had been seething, holding on to a raw, unspoken rage that had begun to eat away at him. Every meeting, every interaction with Jason felt like a battle, a game of cat and mouse. Jason, with his cocky smile and self-assured demeanor, had played his cards perfectly. He had moved in on Susan, on the company, and now he was daring to take everything that Mr. Harrison had built. The walls of Mr. Harrison's office seemed to close in on him as he stared at the company's latest report. Jason had been pulling strings behind the scenes, taking credit for Mr. Harrison's hard work, building alliances, and slowly taking over the reins. The affair had already torn apart Mr. Harrison's home life, but the destruction Jason had wrought in his professional world was just as devastating. That evening, Mr. Harrison could feel the heat rising within him. He had tried to hold back, tried to play the role of the composed CEO, but the time for patience was over. His hands trembled as he stared at his phone. Susan had been silent for days, as though the world had become a place where no one could talk, no one could face what had been done. The betrayal was complete, but there was one last confrontation left. Jason had gone too far. He had crossed a line, and now it was time to make him pay. The office was quiet when Jason arrived. Mr. Harrison had called him in for what seemed like a routine meeting, but the tension was thick in the air. Jason walked in with his usual self-confidence, carrying a briefcase that seemed to weigh nothing. His smile, so practiced, was as irritating as ever. Mr. Harrison stood up as soon as Jason entered, his eyes locking with the young consultant's, and in that moment, everything in him screamed for retribution. "You think you can just walk into my life, my company, and take everything, don't you?" Mr. Harrison's voice was low but intense. Every word dripped with barely contained fury. Jason didn't flinch. "I don't know what you mean, Harrison. I've only been doing my job the way I was hired to do it. You know, business is competitive." He said it with that insufferable smirk, as if he were still the charming consultant Mr. Harrison had once trusted. "No!" Mr. Harrison snapped, stepping closer to him. "This isn't about business. This is personal. You've used my wife. You've used me, and now you're trying to destroy everything I've worked for. You think I didn't see it? The way you wormed your way into her life, the way you've taken over my company, my clients. All of this was calculated. You've been planning this for months." Jason's smile faltered for a split second, but then he recovered, straightening his posture. "You're being paranoid, Harrison. This is business. I didn't ask for any of this. You should have kept your personal life separate from your work life, and maybe we wouldn't be here now." That was it. That smug, arrogant response was the final straw. The words he had been holding back surged forward. "You think this is just business?" Mr. Harrison seethed. You destroyed my marriage, my company, and you have the audacity to sit there and tell me it's just business?" His hands were clenched into fists, the anger boiling inside him. He had to fight the urge to lash out physically. He had worked his entire life to control his emotions, but now that control was slipping away. Jason, unfazed by the outburst, leaned back in his chair. "Harrison, look, you've got it all wrong. If you had just paid more attention to your marriage, your company, none of this would have happened. You were too busy focusing on the wrong things." Mr. Harrison's chest tightened. It felt as though the room itself was closing in on him. He had spent years building his empire, sacrificing so much of his personal life, only to have it all ripped away by someone he had trusted, someone who had used every weakness against him. His family, his business, his pride, all of it had been destroyed. "You don't get it, do you?" Mr. Harrison's voice was quieter now, a dangerous calm settling over him. "This isn't just about you taking what's mine. This is about you ruining everything that I've built, everything I've worked for. And you've done it without an ounce of remorse. You didn't just betray me. You broke everything that mattered." Jason finally stood up, a little taller now, his smirk replaced by something colder. "You're making a mistake, Harrison. You've always been so self-righteous, so consumed with your own little world. Well, it's time to face reality." Reality. The word cut through the tension like a knife. Mr. Harrison suddenly realized that Jason had no remorse, no guilt. He was just a player, and he had played his cards expertly. All of the frustration and anger that had built up over weeks of manipulation and deceit suddenly became clear. Jason wasn't going to apologize. He wasn't going to show any signs of regret. He was in control now, and there was nothing Mr. Harrison could do about it. The silence in the room felt suffocating. For a moment, neither man moved. The weight of the confrontation settled in, and Mr. Harrison knew deep down that this was the moment where his life had irrevocably changed. He was done. This wasn't just a battle for his marriage or his company anymore. This was a war, and Jason had already won. The days after the confrontation with Jason were a blur for Mr. Harrison. The world around him seemed to lose all meaning, his life unraveling in ways he had never imagined. He was no longer in control. Everything he had worked for, the career, the family, the life he had spent decades building, was slipping through his fingers like sand. The affair, the betrayal, and Jason's relentless rise within the company had left Mr. Harrison broken. But it wasn't just the personal betrayal that stung. It was the collapse of everything he had built. The company, which had once been his pride, was now in turmoil. Clients were pulling out. The press was eating up every inch of the scandal, and Jason, with his calm demeanor, was positioning himself to take over the very things Mr. Harrison had fought so hard to create. He sat in his office, the silence surrounding him deafening. The papers on his desk were untouched. Emails and messages piled up, but he couldn't bring himself to open them. His mind was in a haze. Each notification felt like a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The company was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His board members had started questioning his leadership, his ability to keep the company afloat. Rumors of his downfall spread through the corporate world like wildfire. The stress, the betrayal, and the weight of his failure were taking their toll. He couldn't escape it. He tried to bury himself in work, but the harder he worked, the deeper he sank. His once sharp focus was clouded by the mess of his personal life bleeding into his professional world. One morning, as Mr. Harrison walked into the office, he was greeted by his assistant with a grim expression. "Harrison, there's an urgent call for you," she said, handing him the phone. "It's from the media." He knew what this was about. It was another interview, another inquiry into the chaos surrounding his marriage and his company. He picked up the phone, his hand shaking slightly. "Mr. Harrison, we've been following the developments closely," the reporter on the other end said. "Can you comment on the rumors regarding your company's future? There are reports suggesting that you're about to lose your position as CEO." The words struck him like a punch to the gut. He could feel his chest tighten as he tried to collect himself. His breath caught in his throat. "I have no comment at this time," he said, his voice flat. The line went silent for a moment before the reporter pushed further. "Is it true that you and your wife are separated, and that Jason Turner has become a key figure in the company's operations?" Mr. Harrison's mind reeled. He had been hoping to avoid this to keep his personal life from being paraded across the media. But it was all out there now. Everything he had worked so hard to keep hidden. The affair, the breakdown of his marriage, Jason's calculated rise. It was all laid bare for the world to see. "I said I have no comment," he repeated, his voice strained. The call ended, but the damage had been done. The scandal had reached new heights. The company's stock price began to plummet, investors grew skittish, and the board began asking uncomfortable questions. As the pressure mounted, Mr. Harrison felt more and more isolated. He had no allies left. Susan had distanced herself from him, and Jason, who had once been a trusted consultant, was now taking advantage of the chaos to further his own career. The following week, Mr. Harrison's worst fears were confirmed. He was called into an emergency board meeting. The room was filled with stern faces, all of them avoiding his gaze. His position as CEO was under threat. "You've been underperforming, Harrison," one of the board members said coldly. "The company's future is uncertain, and your personal issues are causing instability. We've decided to make a change." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. His grip on the company was slipping, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Jason had maneuvered his way into the right circles, gaining the trust of the board, all while Mr. Harrison had been left to fight his personal battles. The company was now set to be handed over to Jason, an outcome that felt like the ultimate betrayal. Mr. Harrison left the meeting with a heavy heart, the weight of everything collapsing on him. His career was over, his marriage in tatters, and the life he had built was no longer his own. He walked through the office, his eyes glazed over as he passed his former colleagues. They barely acknowledged him, their faces full of pity. He couldn't look anyone in the eye. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his office, the realization finally sank in. Jason had won, not just in his personal life, but in his career as well. The man who had once trusted Jason now found himself outplayed at every turn. The shame was unbearable. In that moment, Mr. Harrison understood the full extent of his collapse. It wasn't just about the betrayal or the loss of his position. It was about the realization that he had lost control of everything. And now, standing in the ruins of his own life, he could only wonder how it had all gone so terribly wrong. The phone calls, the meetings, the press, it all became a blur as Mr. Harrison sat in the empty space of his office. He had been stripped of everything. His company, the very thing he had dedicated his life to, was now in Jason's hands. His marriage, once strong, had crumbled under the weight of betrayal, and yet nothing felt as real as the silence that now filled his life. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was trapped in a nightmare. The endless media reports, the whispers of his colleagues, the growing distance between him and Susan, it all felt like an impenetrable fog. Every time he looked at his phone, a new message from a colleague or an investor reminded him that his life was no longer his own. The company he had built, the reputation he had worked so hard to protect, was in ruins. And Susan, his wife, his partner, had become a ghost in his life. The last conversation they had shared, the one where she had admitted the affair, replayed in his mind like a haunting echo. She had apologized, begged for forgiveness, but nothing had changed. The love he once felt for her was now marred by the overwhelming sense of betrayal. He didn't know how to move forward with her or without her. Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. It felt like the walls were closing in on him. He had been so consumed with work, with proving himself, that he had overlooked the cracks in his personal life. He had been blind to the growing distance between him and Susan, to the loneliness that had taken root in their marriage. The truth was clear now. His professional success had come at the expense of everything else, and in his quest to build an empire, he had lost everything that truly mattered. He thought back to the early days of his marriage when everything had seemed perfect. They had been a team, working side by side, building a life together. But somewhere along the way, the connection they had shared had faded, replaced by the cold, demanding grip of ambition. He had thought he could keep everything balanced, his work, his marriage, his family, but he had been wrong. The lies, the secrecy, and the affair had shattered the illusion he had tried to maintain. The world outside his office continued to spin, but Mr. Harrison felt disconnected from it all. The company, once his pride, was now a reminder of everything he had lost. Investors had begun pulling their funds, key clients had started to distance themselves, and the press, always hungry for a story, had taken aim at his personal life. The scandal had become the center of attention, overshadowing the years of hard work he had put into building his business. His thoughts turned to Jason, who had made everything even worse. Not only had Jason stolen his wife, but he had also seized control of the company, moving in and taking advantage of the chaos. Jason was now the one at the center of the company's future, while Mr. Harrison was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. Jason had become everything Mr. Harrison had once been, the face of success, the one everyone admired, and in the process he had taken everything that had once belonged to Mr. Harrison, from his marriage to his legacy. The collapse wasn't just financial, it was personal. He had lost his wife, his position as CEO, and his sense of self. The man who had once prided himself on being a leader, a protector of his family and his company, now found himself reduced to a shell of his former self. And the most crushing part was that he had no one to blame but himself. As Mr. Harrison walked through the empty halls of the office, he saw the faces of his former colleagues, all of them now avoiding his gaze. They had once respected him, admired him for his dedication, but now he was just another casualty of the corporate world, a man who had failed to adapt, failed to see the cracks before they had become chasms. His phone buzzed, pulling him back from his thoughts. It was a message from Susan. He stared at the screen for a long moment before opening it. "I'm sorry for everything. I never meant for it to turn out this way." The message was short, devoid of emotion. He had expected more, a plea for reconciliation perhaps, or some sign that she still cared. But instead, all he saw was a cold finality in her words. The apology, the regret, the realization of the damage they had both caused. It all felt hollow. He knew that whatever was left between them could never be repaired. He sat down at his desk again, feeling the weight of everything. The company, once his everything, was now a reminder of everything he had lost. And Susan was no longer the woman he had married. She was a shadow, a ghost of the past. His life had been torn apart, piece by piece. The empire he had built, the family he had loved, and the future he had dreamed of, all of it was gone. The days after the collapse were long and silent. Mr. Harrison had nothing left to hold on to but the fragments of a life that had been destroyed. His office, once a symbol of his achievements, now felt like a tomb, the walls closing in on him. The whispers in the company had died down, but the silence that followed was deafening. His phone no longer buzzed with calls or messages from colleagues. The world, it seemed, had moved on without him. He had spent weeks alone, wrestling with his thoughts, but there was no escaping the overwhelming truth. He had lost it all. The company he had built with sweat and sacrifice, his marriage, his dignity, gone. Jason had won, and Mr. Harrison had no one to blame but himself. He had been so consumed by the need for success, by ambition, that he had ignored the cracks in his life until they were too deep to fix. But as the days passed, a strange sense of clarity began to settle over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't chasing something. He wasn't fighting to prove himself, to keep up appearances, or to outdo everyone else. He was simply existing. And in that space, he started to reflect on what had brought him here. The thought of Susan, the woman he had once loved, still lingered in his mind. They had shared so much, yet they had drifted apart in the pursuit of their separate lives. It wasn't just the affair that had broken them. It was the distance that had grown between them long before Jason had entered the picture. They had both been so focused on their own worlds that they had stopped seeing each other. It was in this quiet reflection that Mr. Harrison finally saw the truth. He had never truly been present for Susan. His obsession with work, with building an empire, had left her to fend for herself. He had taken her love for granted, assuming that it would always be there, but in the end, it wasn't enough. She had needed him, needed his attention, his care, but he had given her nothing but his ambition. And then there was Jason, the man who had come into his life as an ally, a trusted consultant, and had ultimately betrayed him in every way imaginable. But as much as Mr. Harrison hated to admit it, Jason had taught him a valuable lesson. That people are capable of far more than you can ever imagine, both good and bad. Jason had been ruthless, manipulative, and selfish, but in some twisted way he had made Mr. Harrison confront the parts of himself that he had ignored for years. The things that truly mattered were not the power or the control, but the relationships, the trust, the connection, the people you choose to share your life with. And he had failed at that. The quiet reflection continued, and Mr. Harrison realized that redemption was not something that could be earned through another business deal or through vengeance against Jason. It wasn't about reclaiming what he had lost. It was about healing, about accepting his mistakes, and learning to let go. There was no more fight left in him, no more battles to win. All he could do now was rebuild, first within himself, and then perhaps in the world around him. A call came one afternoon, and for the first time in weeks, Mr. Harrison answered it. It was from Susan. Her voice was soft, tentative, as though she wasn't sure what to say or whether he would even listen. "I've been thinking a lot, Harrison," she said, her voice shaky, "about everything, about what we've lost, and I don't know if I can fix what we had, but I want to try. I want to be better, for both of us." There was a pause, and for a moment Mr. Harrison didn't know what to say. His heart, still bruised by everything that had happened, felt heavy in his chest. But somewhere deep inside, he knew that this was the moment to let go of the past and try to move forward. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Mr. Harrison replied, his voice low. "But I can try to understand. Maybe that's the first step." They didn't have all the answers, but they both knew that healing would take time. There was no magic fix, no instant resolution. But there was a chance, just a small, fragile chance to rebuild. Not as they had been before, but as something different. Stronger, perhaps, wiser, and maybe, just maybe, they could start again. As Mr. Harrison sat back in his chair, he realized that redemption didn't come from the outside world. It didn't come from the press or the opinions of others. It came from within. It was about accepting his flaws, his mistakes, and understanding that, while the past could never be undone, the future was still his to shape. What do you think of Mr. Harrison's journey through betrayal and redemption? Do you think he can ever rebuild his life after everything he's lost? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences.